Her poor 7-year-old girl turns up out of the blue at a job interview run by a ruthless millionaire. He laughs at her in front of everyone, thinking she's just another lost child. But when she starts speaking fluent German, his smile instantly disappears. When he finds out her surname, he's completely shocked. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel, don't forget to like this video, and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The marble floors of Lichtenberg. The associates gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights on that sweltering Monday morning. The lobby buzzed with the usual parade of power suits and designer briefcases, each aspiring candidate rehearsing their carefully crafted elevator pitches. Sarah, the receptionist, glanced at her watch for the 10th time that hour, mentally counting down the minutes until her lunch break. The revolving door spun once again, but this time something different emerged. A slight figure stepped into the pristine lobby, immediately causing a ripple of whispers to spread through the gathered crowd. The girl couldn't have been more than 15, her feet bare against the cold marble, wearing a simple cotton dress. That stood in stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits surrounding her. In her arms, she clutched a worn notebook as if it were a shield. The security guards exchanged meaningful glances, their hands hovering near their radios. But something in the girl's demeanor made them hesitate. She walked with purpose, her chin held high straight to the reception desk. When she spoke, her voice carried a distinct rural accent, but her words were clear and confident. "I'm here for the interview." Laughter erupted from several of the waiting candidates. One of them, a man in an Italian suit worth more than most people's monthly salary, pulled out his phone and started recording, muttering something about poverty tourism. The girl didn't flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on Sarah, who struggled to maintain her professional composure. "Which position are you here for?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the skepticism from her voice. "The German translator position, the E," girl replied, her tone unwavering. The laughter grew louder. The position in question was practically ceremonial, a formality posting required by corporate policy. Everyone knew the real candidate had already been chosen from among 3 pre-selected applicants with impressive international credentials. The position demanded absolute fluency, years of experience, and an extensive understanding of financial terminology in both languages. Friedrich Lichtenberg, the billionaire CEO known for his cutting wit and unforgiving standards, had personally overseen the selection process. His reputation for being ruthlessly selective was legendary in the industry. There were stories of him dismissing Harvard graduates mid-sentence during interviews simply because their German accent wasn't perfect. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself adding the girl's name to the list. Perhaps it was the quiet determination in those young eyes, or maybe it was simple curiosity about what would happen when she met the notorious Mr. Lichtenberg. Either way, she directed the girl to take a seat in the waiting area, where she sat, quietly, still clutching her notebook. The other candidates kept their distance, creating a visible bubble of empty chairs around her. They continued their hushed conversations, occasionally glancing in her direction with mixtures of amusement and disdain. The girl appeared oblivious to their reactions, focused instead on her notebook, occasionally making small notes in the margins. Time ticked by, and one by one candidates were called into the interview room, emerging with varying degrees of confidence or defeat. The girl waited patiently, her posture never slouching, her attention never wavering. When the last designer suit had disappeared through the door, she remained still as a statue in the now quiet lobby. Finally, Friedrich Lichtenberg himself emerged from his office, his steel-grey hair perfectly coiffed, his custom-made suit immaculate. He was reviewing a file as he walked, not bothering to look up until he reached the reception desk. When Sarah quietly informed him about the final candidate, his head snapped up, cold blue eyes scanning the lobby until they landed on the girl. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation. "This must be some kind of joke," he said, his German accent becoming more pronounced, as it always did when he was annoyed. But before he could dismiss her, the girl stood up, opened her notebook and spoke words that would change both their lives forever. What happened next would become the stuff of corporate legend, though few would ever know the true story behind. that extraordinary morning. As the girl prepared to demonstrate her knowledge, neither she nor Friedrich could have predicted the cascade of events their meeting would trigger, or the long-buried secrets it would eventually reveal. Friedrich's dismissive smirk froze on his face as the girl began to speak. Her German was flawless, each word pronounced with the precision of a native speaker from Munich, his own hometown. She didn't just answer his questions, she dissected complex financial terms with the ease of a seasoned professional, seamlessly switching between regional dialects as she explained. Various concepts. Ihre Annahmen über meine Fähigkeiten sind voreilig, she said, her accent perfect. Your assumptions about my capabilities are premature. She continued in German, discussing international trade policies with remarkable insight, even referencing obscure regulatory frameworks that only industry veterans typically knew about. Friedrich found himself leaning forward, his initial disdain replaced by growing fascination. He tested her with increasingly difficult scenarios, throwing in idiomatic expressions that even experienced translators often stumbled over. She handled each challenge with grace, sometimes offering multiple interpretations of particularly nuanced phrases. The worn notebook she carried contained hand-drawn diagrams of German grammar structures, lists of vocabulary organized by industry, sector, and detailed notes on regional variations in business terminology. The pages were filled with careful annotations showing years of dedicated study, but it was the handwriting in the margins that caught Friedrich's attention. Something about it seemed hauntingly familiar. "Where did you learn German?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady as an uncomfortable suspicion began to form in his mind. "My mother taught me the basics," she replied simply. "The rest I learned from discarded books and by listening to university lectures through open windows. When the library threw away old German newspapers, I would collect them. Every word, every phrase was a puzzle piece." Friedrich's hands began to tremble slightly as he turned another page in her notebook. The girl's story of self-education was impressive, but it was the way she formed her letters, the slight tilt to her writing. It was exactly like Clara's. Clara, who had walked out of his life 7 years ago, leaving nothing but a void that he had filled with work and calculated indifference. He forced himself to maintain his professional demeanor, but his mind was racing. The girl's age, her features, the familiar handwriting, it all pointed to a possibility he wasn't prepared to face. He asked for her full name, and when she gave it, the impact hit him like a physical blow. While it wasn't the same as Clara's, there was something in the way she said it that made his chest tighten. The interview continued, but Friedrich was barely aware of his own questions. He watched the girl's mannerisms, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, just like Clara used to do. The way her eyes lit up when discussing literature, the slight tilt of her head when considering a complex question. Each gesture was a ghost from his past, come back to haunt him in this most unexpected form. The other candidates were forgotten. Friedrich's secretary knocked twice, reminding him of his next appointment, but he waved her away. He needed answers, but he was afraid to ask the questions burning in his mind. Instead, he kept testing her knowledge, using their conversation as a shield against the emotional storm brewing inside him. "One final question," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Why here? Why this company?" The girl's answer was simple but devastating. "Because this is where I needed to be." There was something in her tone, a weight to her words that suggested layers of meaning he couldn't yet grasp. Friedrich dismissed her with instructions to leave her contact information with his secretary, knowing full well he would be making some discreet inquiries before the day was over. As the girl gathered her notebook and prepared to leave, Friedrich noticed something fall from between its pages, a small folded photograph. He reached for it, but she was quicker, snatching it up and carefully tucking it away. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Friedrich saw something there that shook him to his core, a mirror of his own guarded pain, his own carefully hidden longing. The girl left the office, but her presence lingered like a ghost. Friedrich stood at his window, watching as she crossed the plaza below, her bare feet somehow maintaining their dignity against the expensive stonework. His mind was already formulating plans, making calls he never thought he'd make again, reopening doors he'd sworn would stay forever closed. What he didn't know was that across town, another player had already entered the game. Andreas Körber, his former partner and current rival, was about to receive a very interesting phone call about the morning's events at Lichtenberg and Associates. The chess pieces were being set, though none of the players yet knew the true stakes of the game they were about to play. Andreas Körber sat in his penthouse office, a glass of aged scotch untouched before him, as he reviewed the surveillance photos for the third time. The barefooted girl entering Lichtenberg and Associates, Friedrich's expression as he watched her leave, the worn notebook clutched to her chest, each image told part of a story he was desperate to piece together. 7 years ago, he had lost everything in a power struggle with Friedrich. Their partnership, once the talk of the financial world, had dissolved in a bitter confrontation that left Andreas with nothing but his reputation and a burning desire for redemption. He had rebuilt his empire from scratch, but the humiliation still festered. "Tell me everything again," he commanded, not looking up from the photos. His assistant Jensen cleared his throat nervously. The girl arrived this morning, no appointment, no credentials. She was there for the German translator position. According to our source in reception, Friedrich spent over 2 hours with her, cancelled all his other appointments for the day. Andreas's fingers drummed against his mahogany desk. And her name. When Jensen spoke it, Andreas's hand froze mid-tap. The name triggered a memory, a conversation overheard years ago, between Friedrich and Clara, back when they were still married. They had been discussing baby names, a discussion that had ended in one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "Find Clara," Andreas ordered, his voice sharp. "I want to know everything. Where she's been, what she's been doing for the past 7 years, and most importantly, why this girl showed up now." Within hours, his team had compiled a preliminary report. Clara had disappeared from the corporate world after her divorce from Friedrich, resurfacing in a small town, hundreds of miles away. She had lived quietly, teaching German to local children until her condition 2 years ago. The girl had been raised by a neighboring family, attending local schools where she had shown remarkable aptitude for languages. Andreas leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The timing of Clara's departure, the girl's age, Friedrich's reaction, it all pointed to something explosive, something he could use. He pressed the intercom. "Get me everything on guardianship laws and find out who's legally responsible for the girl now." While his team worked, Andreas pulled up old files from his days as Friedrich's partner. He remembered Clara, brilliant, passionate, and fiercely independent. She had never quite fit into their world of high finance and corporate maneuvering. Her departure had changed Friedrich, turning him colder, more ruthless. The girl was clearly Clara's daughter. The resemblance was striking in the surveillance photos. But was she also Friedrich's? And more importantly, did Friedrich know? The possibilities made Andreas smile for the first time that day. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Marcus, I need you to arrange a meeting with Child Services. We might have a situation involving an underage girl working at Lichtenberg and Associates. Yes, I understand it's sensitive. That's exactly why we need to handle this carefully." Across town, Friedrich sat in his home office, surrounded by old photographs and documents he hadn't looked at in years. His hands trembled as he held a particular photo. Clara on their wedding day, her smile radiant, her eyes full of dreams neither of them had managed to fulfill. His private investigator had already confirmed the basic facts. Clara had relocated to a small town, living modestly as a teacher. The girl, Sophie was her name, had indeed been her daughter. But the investigator's preliminary report held a crucial detail. There was no father listed on the birth certificate. Friedrich reached for his phone several times that evening, wanting to call Sophie to demand answers to the questions burning in his mind. But each time he stopped himself. What right did he have to disrupt her life? And yet, the possibility that she might be his daughter. He picked up an old letter from Clara, dated just before their final argument. She had tried to tell him something important that day, but he had been too absorbed in a major merger to really listen. By the time he got home that evening, she was gone. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His housekeeper entered, with a concerned look. "Sir, there's something you should see." She handed him a tablet open to a news website. The headline made his blood run cold. Child labor scandal brewing at top financial firm? The article was clearly planted with just enough facts to seem credible, while raising alarming questions about Sophie's presence at the firm. Friedrich recognized Andreas's hand in this. His old partner had always excelled at media manipulation. He reached for his phone again, this time dialing his legal team. "I need everything you can find on Sophie's current guardianship situation, and prepare documentation for an immediate internship position. Everything by the book, completely transparent." As he hung up, his eye caught something in one of the old photographs, a detail he had never noticed before. In the background of a picture taken at a company party 7 years ago, Clara was holding her purse in an odd way, almost protective, her other hand resting gently on her stomach. Friedrich felt his world shift slightly on its axis. The timing would be right, but why hadn't she told him? What else had he missed in his single-minded pursuit of corporate success? He walked to his window, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, Sophie was probably studying her beloved German books, unaware of the forces beginning to move around her. He made a decision then. Whatever the truth might be, he would protect her from Andreas's schemes. What he didn't know was that Sophie had secrets of her own, secrets that would soon force everyone to confront truths they had spent years trying to forget. Sophie sat cross-legged on her small bed, surrounded by newspaper clippings and German textbooks. The elderly couple she lived with, the Hendersons, had already gone to sleep, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the soft glow of her desk lamp. She pulled out the photograph she had nearly lost during the interview, the one she had snatched away before Friedrich could see it. It showed a younger, happier Clara, standing in front of Lichtenberg and Associates, her arm linked with Friedrich's. The photo was worn from years of handling, its edges soft and frayed. Her mother had given her this photo along with a sealed envelope on her 13th birthday, making her promise not to open the envelope until the right moment. "You'll know when," Clara had said, her eyes full of meaning Sophie hadn't understood then. Now, 2 years later, Sophie reached under her mattress and pulled out the envelope. It remained sealed, though her fingers had traced its edges countless times. The words on the front, written in her mother's elegant hand, read, "For your father, when the time is right." A soft ping from her laptop interrupted her thoughts. It was an email from Lichtenberg and Associates, an offer for an internship position starting immediately. The salary mentioned was generous, especially for someone her age. There were also details about a special educational provision that would allow her to work while continuing her studies. Sophie smiled. Friedrich had taken the bait, just as her mother had predicted he would. But her satisfaction was interrupted by another email, this one from an address she didn't recognize. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. "Dear Miss Sophie, I was a close friend of your mother's and have recently learned of your situation. I believe there are things about your father you should know before making any decisions about your future. Would you be willing to meet? Regards, Andreas Körber." Sophie's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her response. Her mother had mentioned Andreas in her stories, the brilliant partner who had become Friedrich's greatest rival. She had warned Sophie that he might try to make contact. Downstairs, the phone rang, breaking the evening silence. A few minutes later, Mrs. Henderson called up the stairs, her voice tinged with concern. "Sophie, dear, there's someone from Childy. Service is on the phone. They say they need to speak with you about your work situation." Sophie's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I'll be right down." She quickly gathered her documents, the internship offer, her mother's letter, and most importantly, a small USB drive that contained information her mother had prepared years ago, anticipating this very situation. As she descended the stairs, Sophie recalled her mother's words. "In chess, dear one, the player who appears to be reacting is often the one controlling the game." She had spent years preparing for this moment, learning not just German, but studying Friedrich's business dealings, his patterns, his weaknesses. The child services representative was polite but firm, asking questions about how she had obtained the interview, whether she had been pressured, if she understood her rights as a minor. Sophie answered each question carefully, presenting the internship documentation she had just received. After the call, Mrs. Henderson wrapped her in a worried hug. "Oh, sweetheart, what have you gotten yourself into?" Sophie hugged her back, grateful for the genuine concern. "Everything's going to be fine," she assured her guardian. "This is all part of the plan." Back in her room, Sophie finally composed her response to Andreas. "Dear Mr. Kerber, thank you for your concern. I would be interested in hearing what you have to say. Perhaps we could meet somewhere public. Best regards, Sophie." She sent the email, then pulled out her notebook, the one Friedrich had been so interested in. Behind the German vocabulary lists and grammar notes was another section, written in a code she and her mother had developed together. It detailed everything she would need to know about both Friedrich and Andreas, their history, their weaknesses, their secrets. Sophie closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice. Sometimes love needs a little push to find its way home. Tomorrow would be her first day at Lichtenberg and Associates, her first real step into the world her mother had once been part of. As she prepared for bed, Sophie glanced at the sealed envelope one more time. Not yet, she decided. The pieces weren't all in place. Friedrich needed to remember who he used to be before he could understand who he had become, and more importantly, who he could still be. What neither Friedrich nor Andreas knew was that their carefully constructed world of power plays and corporate intrigue was about to be transformed by a 15-year-old girl who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Sophie turned off her lamp and smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would be just the beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows through the glass walls of Lichtenberg and Associates as Sophie walked into the building, this time wearing modest but professional clothing that Mrs. Henderson had insisted on buying her. Her bare feet were now covered in simple black flats, but she still clutched her worn notebook, a reminder of who she was and why she was here. The reception area fell silent, as she entered just as it had before, but this time Sarah greeted her with a practiced smile and a security badge. "Mr. Lichtenberg would like to see you in his office before you begin," she said, her eyes curious but kind. The elevator ride to the executive floor gave Sophie time to observe her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked younger in proper business attire, more vulnerable somehow. But that could work to her advantage. Her mother had taught her that people's underestimation was often their greatest weapon against them. Friedrich's office was a testament to corporate success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, modern art worth millions adorning the walls, and a desk large enough to land a small plane. But what caught Sophie's attention was a small frame partially hidden behind a stack of files, a photograph she recognized from her own collection, though his copy wasn't worn from years of tender handling. "Good morning," Friedrich said, his voice carefully neutral. He had obviously taken great pains to appear casual, but Sophie noticed the coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand. "I trust you've reviewed the internship documentation." Sophie nodded, taking the seat he indicated. "The terms are very generous," she said, switching to German, "though I noticed there's no mention of the translator position I interviewed for." Friedrich's eyes narrowed slightly at her perfect accent. "The internship will involve various responsibilities, including translation work. But first, there are some formalities we need to discuss." He pulled out a thick folder and began explaining the various legal requirements for employing a minor. Sophie listened patiently, noting how he kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, searching her features for traces of Clara. "There's also the matter of your guardianship," he said finally, his tone carefully professional. "The Hendersons are your legal guardians." "They've been very kind to me," Sophie replied, deliberately avoiding a direct answer. She opened her notebook, pulling out some papers. "I have their signed permission for the internship." Friedrich took the documents, but his attention was caught by something else. a small notation in the margin of her notebook, written in Clara's distinctive hand. His fingers tightened on the papers, and for a moment Sophie saw raw pain flash across his face before his corporate mask slipped back into place. "There's one other thing," he said, reaching into his desk drawer. "In light of recent media attention, we'll need to be particularly careful about documentation and appearances." He pushed a newspaper across the desk, the article Andreas had planted about potential child labor issues. Sophie picked up the paper, pretending to read it thoughtfully while watching Friedrich's reflection in the window behind him. His posture was tense, protective even. Everything was proceeding exactly as her mother had predicted. "Mr. Kerber contacted me," she said, casually, noting how Friedrich's shoulders stiffened at the name. "He seems very concerned about my welfare." Friedrich's coffee cup clicked sharply against its saucer. "Andreas Kerber is not someone you should be speaking with," he said, his accent becoming more pronounced with emotion. "He has his own agenda." "Don't we all?" Sophie replied softly, meeting his eyes. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Friedrich opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by his intercom buzzing. "Sir, the board members are waiting in the conference room." Friedrich stood straightening his tie in a nervous gesture that reminded Sophie so much of her mother's descriptions that it made her heart ache. "Ms. Weber will show you to your desk," he said, gesturing to his assistant who had appeared at the door. "We'll continue this discussion later." As Sophie followed Ms. Weber through the maze of cubicles and corner offices, she could feel Friedrich's eyes following her. She remembered her mother's words. "He buries his feelings beneath work and wealth, but beneath all that armor beats the heart of a man who once wrote poetry in the margins of financial reports." Her desk was in a quiet corner with a clear view of both Friedrich's office and the elevator bay. Strategic positioning, she noted. He wanted to keep her close and observable. On the desk was a state-of-the-art computer and a stack of documents requiring German translation. "Mr. Lichtenberg asked that you start with these," Ms. Weber said, indicating the documents. "Though between us, these usually go to our Berlin office. I've never seen him keep translation work in-house before." Sophie nodded, already booting up the computer. As Ms. Weber walked away, Sophie pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to a number she had memorized years ago. "Phase 1. Complete. He's watching." The response came almost immediately. "Good. Remember, patience is key. Let him come to the truth on his own terms." Sophie tucked her phone away and began working on the translations, but her mind was already moving several steps ahead. She had planted the seeds: Friedrich's curiosity about her origins, his protective instincts, his suspicions about Andreas's involvement. Now she just had to wait for them to grow. What she didn't expect was the message that popped up on her computer screen an hour later. "My office, 3 p.m., bring your notebook, AK." Andreas was making his move sooner than anticipated. Sophie smiled slightly as she typed her response, looking forward to it. The game was evolving, pieces moving faster than expected, but that was fine. After all, she had been preparing for this her entire life. Andreas Kerber's office at Kerber International was everything Friedrich's wasn't. Warm woods instead of cold steel, classic artwork rather than modern abstracts, and a view of the park instead of the financial district. It was designed to put visitors at ease, to make them lower their guard. Sophie noted all of this as she was led in by his personal assistant at precisely 3 p.m. "Ah, Sophie." Andreas rose from behind his desk, his smile practiced but warm. "Thank you for coming. I hope Friedrich didn't give you any trouble about this meeting." "Mr. Lichtenberg doesn't know I'm here," Sophie replied, taking the offered seat. She placed her notebook in her lap, one hand resting protectively on its worn cover. Andreas's smile widened slightly. "Direct and honest, just like your mother." He walked to a cabinet and pulled out a photo album. "Clara and I were friends, you know, before everything fell apart." Sophie watched as he flipped through the pages, showing photographs of happier times, company parties, charity events, casual gatherings. In many of them, Clara stood between Friedrich and Andreas. her smile bright, unaware of the storm brewing between the two men. "Your mother was the heart of that company," Andreas said, his voice soft with what seemed like genuine regret. "When she left, everything changed. Friedrich became harder, colder. The company became just another, soulless financial institution." He looked at Sophie intently. "But you know all this already, don't you?" Clara would have made sure of that. Sophie met his gaze steadily. "My mother told me many stories," she acknowledged, "about both of you." Andreas leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Did she tell you why she left? The real reason?" "Perhaps." "You should tell me your version," Sophie suggested, her voice carefully neutral. Andreas stood and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back. Friedrich was obsessed with success, with proving himself worthy of the Lichtenberg name. He couldn't see what was right in front of him, a woman who loved him, who was trying to tell him something important. He turned back to face Sophie. "The day Clara left, she came to see me first. She was distraught, said she had tried to tell Friedrich something crucial, but he was too busy with a merger to listen. I offered to help to talk to him, but she refused, said some things needed to be discovered, not told." Sophie's hand tightened on her notebook, but her face remained impassive. Andreas was revealing more than he realized, details only someone who had been there that day would know. "And now here you are," Andreas continued, "appearing out of nowhere, with your perfect German and your mother's eyes. It hasn't taken..." Friedrich longed to start moving pieces around the board to protect you. The internship, the legal documentation, the media management, all within 24 hours of meeting you. He sat down again, leaning forward. "But what fascinates me is how prepared you seem for all of this. That notebook, for instance. I'd love to know what's really written in those margins." Sophie smiled slightly. "Just German vocabulary. Mr. Körber, feel free to look." She held out the notebook. Andreas waved it away. "We both know there's more to it than that. Just like we both know you're not here by chance. Clara was many things, but she was never careless. She prepared you for this, didn't she?" "My mother taught me many things," Sophie replied, "including how to recognize when someone is fishing for information." Andreas laughed, a genuine appreciative sound. "Oh, you are definitely Clara's daughter. And Friedrich's too, I'd wager. Though he hasn't figured that out yet, has he?" Sophie stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for the history lesson, Mr. Körber, but if you'll excuse me, I have translations waiting." "Of course," Andreas rose as well. "But before you go, a friendly warning. Friedrich may seem protective now, but his priorities have always been clear. When he has to choose between you and his company's reputation, well, just remember where Clara ended up." Sophie paused at the door. "You know what I find interesting, Mr. Körber? How much effort you're putting into appearing to be my ally while simultaneously trying to use me against Friedrich. My mother warned me about that too." She left Andreas standing in his office, a mix of surprise and admiration on his face. As she walked to the elevator, her phone buzzed with a text from Friedrich. "Where are you? We need to talk." Sophie smiled as she typed her response. "On my way back, and yes, we do." The pieces were moving faster now, the game accelerating. But that was fine. Sometimes the best way to control chaos was to create it yourself. As she stepped into the elevator, Sophie finally understood what her mother had meant about the right moment for the letter. It wasn't about timing, it was about preparation. And now, finally, she was ready. Friedrich paced his office like a caged lion, his normally immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His tie was slightly loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly. On his desk lay a stack of papers, the results of his private investigation into Sophie's background. When she entered his office, he stopped pacing but didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that would have made most people uncomfortable. Sophie met his gaze calmly, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the coffee cups littering his desk. "You went to see Andreas," he finally said. Not a question, but a statement heavy with contained emotion. "Yes," Sophie replied simply, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. He showed me some interesting photographs. You used to smile more back then. Friedrich's jaw tightened. Andreas Körber is a manipulator. Whatever he told you. He told me about the day my mother left, Sophie interrupted, watching Friedrich's reaction carefully. How she tried to tell you something important, but you were too busy with a merger. The color drained from Friedrich's face. He gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles turning white. That's not... I didn't know... He stopped, collecting himself. There are things about that time you don't understand. Sophie opened her notebook, pulling out a photograph, the same one she had almost lost during her interview. She placed it on his desk, watching as his hands trembled slightly when he picked it up. I understand more than you think, she said softly. My mother made sure of that. Friedrich sank into his chair, the photograph still in his hands. Clara, he whispered, tracing her image with his finger. She was trying to tell me something that day. I kept putting her off, saying we'd talk later. Always later. His voice cracked slightly. When I finally got home that night, she was gone. All she left was a note saying some things couldn't wait forever. And you never tried to find her? Sophie asked, though she already knew the answer. I did. Friedrich stood abruptly, moving to the window. I hired investigators, searched for months, but Clara, she knew how to disappear when she wanted to. It was like she vanished into thin air. He turned back to Sophie. Until you walked into my lobby. Sophie pulled another document from her notebook, her birth certificate. She placed it on his desk without comment. Friedrich approached slowly as if the paper might bite him. His hands shook as he picked it up, eyes scanning the details. The date, he whispered. 7 months after she left. He looked up at Sophie, his face a mask of dawning comprehension and pain. She was pregnant. That's what she was trying to tell me. Yes, Sophie said simply. Friedrich collapsed back into his chair. Why didn't she tell me in a letter? Why didn't she make sure I knew? Perhaps, Sophie suggested, her voice gentle. She tried to tell you in person because some things shouldn't be revealed in a letter. Perhaps she needed to see in your eyes that you were ready to hear it. Friedrich's head snapped up, studying her face with new intensity. You look so much like her, he said softly. But your eyes, those are my mother's eyes. Before Sophie could respond, Friedrich's computer chimed with an urgent email. His face darkened as he read it. Andreas has called an emergency board. Meeting for tomorrow morning. He's going to try to use this situation to force me out. He looked at Sophie. He's going to claim I've been hiding my relationship with you, that I've been engaging in nepotism and endangering the company. What are you going to do? Sophie asked, watching him carefully. Friedrich straightened in his chair, his corporate mask sliding back into place. What I have to. I'll deny any relation to you, claim the internship was purely based on merit, with no proof of paternity. Stop, Sophie interrupted, her voice firm. She stood, gathering her things. Before you finish that sentence, I want you to think very carefully about what you're choosing to protect. My mother made the same choice once, between truth and appearances. She chose truth, even though it meant walking away from everything she knew. She walked to the door, then turned back. You have until tomorrow morning to decide what kind of man you want to be. The kind who hides behind corporate policies and legal documents, or the kind who once wrote poetry in the margins of financial reports. Friedrich's head snapped up at those words he had never told anyone about, words that could only have come from Clara. Sophie, wait. But she was already gone, leaving Friedrich alone with a birth certificate, a photograph, and the weight of 15 years of choices. What he didn't know was that Sophie had one more document with her, the sealed letter from her mother, still unopened. As she walked through the lobby, she pulled out her phone and sent a text to Mrs. Henderson. It's time. Please bring the box my mother left. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. The only question was whether Friedrich would rise to meet the moment or remain trapped behind the walls he had built around his heart. The night settled over the city like a heavy blanket, but sleep eluded both Friedrich and Sophie as they prepared for the coming storm in their own ways. In his penthouse apartment, Friedrich sat surrounded by old boxes he hadn't opened in years. Each contained memories of his life with Clara. Photographs, letters, small mementos he hadn't been able to throw away. In one box he found what he had been looking for. His old financial reports, their margins filled with poetry he had written while building his empire. He pulled out one particularly worn document, reading the words he had scribbled 15 years ago. Between profit and loss, lives, the cost of chances missed. When numbers blind us to truth and balance sheets hide beating hearts. His younger self had understood something he had forgotten, somewhere along the way. He reached for his phone several times to call Sophie, but stopped himself each time. What could he say? That he was sorry for missing the signs, that he had been too focused on his company to see what was right in front of him? Meanwhile, across town, Sophie sat cross-legged on her bed as Mrs. Henderson brought in a dusty box, the one Clara had left in her care years ago. "She said you'd know when it was time," the elderly woman said, her kind eyes worried. "Are you sure that time is now?" Sophie nodded, opening the box carefully. Inside were documents, photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. But what caught her attention was a USB drive labeled simply, "For the board." She plugged it into her laptop, her heart racing as she opened the files. What she found made her breath catch. Dozens of emails, financial records, and legal documents, all meticulously organized and annotated in her mother's careful hand. Clara had been preparing for this moment even before Sophie was born. As she read through the materials, Sophie understood why her mother had waited. This wasn't just about Friedrich acknowledging his daughter. It was about forcing him to confront the man he had become and remember the man he used to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Andreas. "Everything is set for tomorrow. Last chance to choose the right side." Sophie smiled slightly as she typed her response. "I already have." She turned back to the box, pulling out her mother's journal. Inside, she found an entry from the day before Clara left. "My dearest Friedrich, by the time you read these words, if you ever do, you will have built your empire higher than ever. But at what cost? The man I fell in love with saw beauty in balance sheets and poetry in profit margins. He understood that true wealth isn't measured in quarterly reports. I'm carrying our child, our future, but I can't tell you yet. Not until I see in your eyes that you remember who you were meant to be. Not just a Lichtenberg, but Friedrich. The man who once stayed up all night helping an intern fix a mistake because everyone deserves a second chance to get things right. Perhaps our child will help you remember. Perhaps they will be the bridge between who you've become and who you truly are." Sophie closed the journal, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. She pulled out the sealed letter, the one she had carried for so long, and placed it in her bag for tomorrow. Everything was ready. In his office at Kerber International, Andreas was also preparing for the morning's battle. His team had compiled a devastating presentation for the board, allegations of nepotism, questions about Sophie's employment, hints of scandal. But something was bothering him, a nagging feeling that he was missing something important. He reviewed the surveillance photos of Sophie again, focusing on her notebook. There was something about the way she protected it, the confidence with which she had offered to show it to him. It was almost as if Andreas sat up straight, suddenly alert. He had been so focused on using Sophie against Friedrich that he had missed the obvious. She had been playing him just as much as she had been playing Friedrich. But to what end? He reached for his phone to set some contingency plans in motion, but stopped when he saw the time. 3:27 a.m. In just a few hours, the board would convene, and everything would change. He just wasn't sure anymore who would be controlling that change. As the night deepened toward dawn, 3 people in different parts of the city prepared for battle, each with their own weapons, their own strategies, their own hopes. But only Sophie knew the full scope of what was about to unfold. She had spent her entire life preparing for tomorrow, carrying her mother's truth like a torch waiting to be lit. The question wasn't whether Friedrich would choose his company or his daughter. It was whether he would finally choose to become the man Clara had always known he could be. The boardroom of Lichtenberg and Associates hummed with tension on that crucial morning. 12 of the most powerful people in the financial world sat around the massive oak table, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Andreas had positioned himself at one end of the table, a sleek presentation folder in front of him. Friedrich occupied his usual place at the head, his face an impassive mask. What no one expected was Sophie's presence, sitting quietly in the corner with her notebook, officially there to take notes as part of her internship duties. Friedrich had raised an eyebrow when she walked in but hadn't objected. Andreas had smiled, assuming she was there to witness his triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andreas began, standing with practiced confidence, "I've called this emergency meeting to address some serious concerns about the direction of Lichtenberg and Associates under its current leadership." He launched his presentation, displaying photographs of Sophie's arrival at the company, documentation of her rushed internship, and carefully selected headlines questioning the propriety of her employment. "What we have here," Andreas continued, his voice grave, "is a clear case of nepotism and potential legal liability. Mr. Lichtenberg has employed a minor under questionable circumstances, creating significant risk for this company." Friedrich remained still, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. The board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Furthermore, Andreas pressed his advantage. "There is reason to believe that Mr. Lichtenberg has been concealing a personal relationship with this intern, a relationship that, if confirmed, would constitute a serious breach of corporate governance." He paused for effect, then delivered what he believed would be his killing blow. "I have evidence suggesting that this young woman is, in fact, Friedrich Lichtenberg's daughter. A fact he has deliberately hidden from this board and our shareholders." The room erupted in murmurs. Friedrich's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but before he could speak, a clear voice cut through the chaos. "Actually, Mr. Körber, you're wrong about one thing." Sophie stood, her notebook clutched to her chest. "Mr. Lichtenberg hasn't been concealing anything, because until yesterday, he didn't know." She walked to the center of the room, her steps measured and confident. "But my mother knew he would figure it out eventually. She prepared for this moment very carefully." Sophie opened her notebook and pulled out a USB drive, the one from her mother's box. "Before anyone makes any decisions today, I think you should see what's on this." Andreas's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't part of his script. "Young lady, this is a formal board meeting. You have no standing here." "On the contrary," Sophie interrupted, her German accent becoming more pronounced, just as Friedrich's did when he was emotional. "As a potential heir to a significant portion of this company's shares, I believe I have every right to be heard." The board chairman, an elderly man who had known Friedrich's father, leaned forward with interest. "What's on the drive, Miss Lichtenberg?" Sophie said firmly, meeting Friedrich's startled gaze. "My name is Sophie Lichtenberg, and this drive contains proof that 7 years ago, Andreas Körber orchestrated a hostile takeover attempt of this company, an attempt that failed only because my mother discovered it and chose to protect both the company and her unborn child by leaving." The color drained from Andreas's face as Sophie connected the drive to the room's presentation system. The screen filled with emails, financial records, and legal documents, all meticulously organized and annotated by Clara. "My mother was more than just Friedrich Lichtenberg's wife," Sophie continued, her voice clear and strong. "She was a brilliant financial analyst who discovered irregularities in certain transactions. When she investigated further, she found evidence that Mr. Körber was working with outside investors to undermine the company's position." Friedrich stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen as years of mystery finally unraveled before him. The document showed a complex web of shell companies and hidden transactions, all designed to weaken Lichtenberg and Associates from within. "Clara discovered all this," he whispered. Sophie nodded. "She tried to tell you that day about both the takeover attempt and her pregnancy, but you were too focused on the merger to listen. So she made a choice. She left, taking both secrets with her, knowing that someday the truth would need to come out." She turned to face the board. "Mr. Körber's presentation today isn't about protecting this company. It's about completing what he failed to do 7 years ago. He's trying to use me to force Mr. Lichtenberg out, just as he tried to use my mother's departure to weaken him then. The boardroom had fallen completely silent. Andreas stood frozen, his careful plans crumbling around him. Friedrich walked slowly to where Sophie stood, his eyes moving between the screen and her face, seeing both Clara's strength and his own determination reflected there. But Sophie wasn't finished. She pulled out one final document, the sealed letter she had carried for so long. "There's one more thing," she said softly, holding it out to Friedrich. "My mother wanted you to have this when you were ready to remember who you really are." Friedrich took the letter with trembling hands, the weight of 15 years of misunderstandings and missed opportunities heavy in the air between them. The boardroom waited in breathless silence as he broke the seal, unfolding the pages that would finally bridge the gap between past and present, between father and daughter, between the man he had become and the man he was meant to be. The boardroom remained frozen in silence as Friedrich unfolded Clara's letter, his hands trembling slightly as he began to read. Sophie watched his face, seeing emotions play across it that he had kept buried for 15 years. "My dearest Friedrich, if you're reading this, then our daughter has found her way back to you, and you've finally begun to remember the man you once were, the man who saw poetry in profit margins and humanity in bottom lines. I need you to understand why I left that day. It wasn't just about the pregnancy, though that was part of it. I had discovered something that threatened everything we had built together, but when I tried to tell you, you were too consumed by the merger to hear me. That's when I realized that the company had become more than just our life's work. It had become a wall between us. The evidence I gathered about Andreas's attempted takeover is included with this letter. I knew that if I brought it forward then, it would have shattered you. You would have seen it as a personal betrayal, and that anger would have changed you even more than my leaving did. I couldn't let that happen, not with our child growing inside me. So, I made a choice. I left, taking both secrets with me, the evidence of betrayal and the promise of new life. I knew someday our paths would cross again, when the time was right, when you were ready to see with your heart instead of just your ledgers. I've raised our daughter to understand both worlds, the one of numbers and negotiations, and the one of poetry and possibility. She speaks your language, Friedrich, both German and financial. But more importantly, she speaks the language of the heart that you used to know so well. The man I fell in love with understood that true wealth isn't measured in quarterly reports. He stayed late helping junior employees understand complex transactions. He wrote poetry between budget meetings because he saw the beauty in balance sheets. That man knew that success without meaning is just numbers on a page. I've taught Sophie everything I know about finance, about language, about life, but I've also taught her about you, the real you, the one who exists beneath the corporate armor you've built around yourself. She carries both our strengths within her, but she also carries something else, the power to help you remember who you were meant to be. The evidence she brings will protect the company from Andreas's ambitions. But this letter isn't about saving the company, it's about saving you. About helping you remember that the greatest investments we make aren't in stocks or bonds, but in the people we love and the legacy we leave behind. You have a choice. Now, Friedrich, you can use this evidence to defeat Andreas and continue ruling your empire from behind walls of wealth and isolation. Or you can choose to tear down those walls, to let our daughter help you bridge the gap between who you've become and who you truly are. I won't be there to see your choice. My condition has made sure of that. But Sophie will be, carrying both, our hopes and dreams within her. She has my determination and your brilliance, but more importantly, she has the wisdom to know that some things are worth more than all the money in the world. Look at her, Friedrich, really look at her. See not just the financial prodigy or the German scholar, but the daughter who has spent her whole life preparing to help her father find his way back to himself. The evidence will save your company, but only love can save you. Forever in my heart, Clara. Friedrich lowered the letter slowly, tears falling freely down his face. The boardroom remained absolutely silent, the morning sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the scene like a painting. He turned to Sophie, seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. Not just as a mysterious intern or a potential heir, but as the miracle she was, the perfect blend of Clara's wisdom and his own drive, of passion and precision, of heart and mind. "I remember," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I remember who I used to be." Sophie stepped forward, taking his hand. "Then be that man again," she said softly in German. "The one who wrote poetry in margins and saw possibility in every problem." Friedrich squeezed her hand, then turned to face the board, his voice growing stronger. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some important matters to discuss. But first," he pulled Sophie closer, his arm around her shoulders, "I'd like to properly introduce you to my daughter, Sophie Lichtenberg." Andreas started to speak, but Friedrich cut him off with a raised hand. "And after that, we'll be reviewing some very interesting documents about corporate governance and loyalty, because it's time for this company to remember what it was meant to be. Not just a financial institution, but a legacy of integrity, innovation, and humanity." The boardroom erupted in activity, but Friedrich and Sophie remained still in their quiet moment of connection, 15 years of separation finally bridged by a mother's love, a daughter's determination, and a father's awakening. The days following the board meeting brought sweeping changes to Lichtenberg and Associates. Friedrich, with Sophie by his side, began dismantling the cold corporate culture he had built over the years, replacing it with something more reminiscent of the company's early days. The first change came in the form of a simple gesture. Friedrich moved his office from the top floor to a more accessible location on the middle level, replacing the imposing steel and glass doors with an open entrance policy. His staff watched in amazement as their formerly distant CEO began stopping by their desks, learning names, asking about families. "You're different," Sarah, the receptionist, remarked one morning as she watched Friedrich help an intern with a heavy stack of files. "It's like you've woken up from a long sleep." Friedrich smiled, adjusting his tie, no longer the severe Windsor knot he'd favored for years, but the more relaxed style Clara had always preferred. "Sometimes," he said, "we need someone to remind us who we really are." Sophie had taken up residence in a small office next to his, her worn notebook now accompanied by state-of-the-art computers and financial terminals. But she still preferred to take notes, by hand, just as her mother had taught her. The margins of her documents often contained not just financial annotations, but small observations about human nature, a habit she had inherited from both parents. One afternoon, Friedrich found her studying an old company photo from his early days as CEO. In it, he stood between Clara and Andreas, all three of them smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders. The future had seemed so bright then, so full of possibility. "I've been thinking about Mr. Kerber," Sophie said without looking up, "about why he did what he did." Friedrich sat down beside her, studying the photograph. "Andreas was brilliant," he admitted, "but he always felt overshadowed by the Lichtenberg name. I never realized how much that ate at him until it was too late." "Mom knew," Sophie said softly. In her journal, she wrote about seeing his pain, how he masked it with ambition. She tried to help him, but I was too blind to see what was happening, Friedrich finished, too focused on proving myself worthy of my father's legacy to notice the friend I was losing. Sophie turned to face him. "It's not too late, you know, to make things right." Friedrich raised an eyebrow. "Andreas tried to destroy this company. He tried to use you against me." "No," Sophie corrected gently. "He tried to use me to wake you up. Everything he did, the media leaks, the board meeting, even his threats, they were all designed to force you to make a choice between the company and your humanity. He just didn't expect Mom to have prepared for that choice years ago." Before Friedrich could respond, his assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, the architectural team is here to discuss the lobby renovation." Friedrich had announced his most ambitious change yet, transforming the imposing marble lobby into a more welcoming space. The plans included a coffee shop open to the public, comfortable seating areas, and most surprisingly, a small art gallery showcasing local artists. "Join me?" he asked Sophie, standing. She smiled, tucking the old photograph into her notebook. "Actually, I have something else to take care of, but I think you know what Mom would have wanted for the space." Friedrich paused at the door, remembering how Clara had always complained about the lobby's coldness, how she'd dreamed of making it more inviting. "Yes," he said softly, "I think I do." As he walked to the meeting, Friedrich passed by Andreas's old office, now empty, the nameplate removed, after his resignation. But instead of triumph, Friedrich felt a deep sadness. He pulled out his phone and began typing a message, then stopped, erasing it. Some things needed to be said in person. Meanwhile, Sophie sat in her office, pulling out another letter from her mother's box, this one addressed to Andreas. Clara had prepared for every possibility, it seemed, including the chance for redemption. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized but never used. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Mr. Kerber, this is Sophie. Lichtenberg, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the past and the future." There was a long pause before Andreas replied, his voice carrying a weight she hadn't heard before. "Your mother would have handled it exactly the same way," he said finally. "She always believed in second chances." "Yes," Sophie agreed, pulling out the sealed letter. "She did. That's why she left this for you." Across town in his penthouse office, Andreas Kerber sat down heavily, emotions he had long suppressed finally breaking through his carefully constructed facade. She left me a letter." "She left letters for everyone who mattered," Sophie explained, "because she believed that sometimes people need to lose their way before they can find their true path." The silence that followed was filled with possibility, the kind that Clara had always seen, that Friedrich was remembering and that Sophie was determined to nurture back to life. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of Lichtenberg and Associates, casting long shadows across the changing landscape of the company. In offices and corridors, employees whispered about the transformation taking place, not just in the physical space, but in the very heart of the organization. And in a small office in the middle of it all, a 15-year-old girl continued her mother's work of healing old wounds and building new bridges, one careful step at a time. The small cafe on the outskirts of the financial district was neutral territory, neither too close to Lichtenberg and Associates nor to Kerber International. Sophie had chosen it carefully, just as she had chosen the time, early evening when the after-work crowd had thinned, but the night rush hadn't yet begun. She arrived first, selecting a quiet corner table where she could see both the entrance and the street outside. Her notebook lay closed beside her coffee cup, Clara's letter to Andreas tucked safely inside. Friedrich arrived next, looking slightly uncomfortable in casual clothes, another recent change in his life. He had started leaving his suit jacket behind more often, rolling up his sleeves, allowing himself to relax into the person he used to be. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Sophie, sitting down beside her. Before she could answer, the cafe's door opened again and Andreas stepped in. He had lost some of his polished edge in the weeks since the board meeting, but there was something else different about him, a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He approached the table slowly, carrying a worn leather briefcase that Sophie recognized from the old company photos. "Friedrich," he nodded. "Sophie." He remained standing, uncertain of his welcome. "Please, sit," Sophie gestured to the empty chair. "Mom would have wanted this." The mention of Clara seemed to release some of the tension. Both men sat, and for a moment they were silent, years of history hanging heavy between them. "I found something," Andreas said finally, opening his briefcase. "While I was clearing out my old files." He pulled out a faded photograph. 3 young professionals standing in front of a shabby office building, their arms around each other's shoulders, their faces bright with hope and ambition. Friedrich leaned forward, recognition flooding his features. "Our first office," he whispered. "Before the marble lobby and the corporate jets. Before we lost our way, Andreas added softly. Sophie watched them study the photograph, seeing the ghosts of their younger selves in their expressions. Mom kept this same photo, she said. She wrote on the back, "The daydreams were enough." Both. Men looked up sharply, and Sophie saw tears in their eyes. She reached into her notebook and pulled out Clara's letter to Andreas. "She wanted you to have this," she said, sliding it across the table, "when the time was right." Andreas stared at the envelope, Clara's elegant handwriting spelling his. To name, his hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Dear Andreas, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong between you and Friedrich. I know you too well, my friend. I know how deeply you feel things, how hard you try to prove your worth to a world that seems to value only names and titles. But I also know the man who spent 3 days teaching the cleaning staff basic accounting so they could better manage their finances. The man who anonymously paid for the receptionist's daughter's college tuition. The man who saw value in people, not just profits. That man was my friend. That man was Friedrich's brother in all but blood. And that man is still there beneath the anger and the hurt. You're reading this letter because Sophie has seen what I always saw, the good heart beneath the wounded pride. She's brought you and Friedrich together because she understands what I learned too late, that sometimes the strongest bridges are built over the deepest chasms. I'm leaving you both something more valuable than evidence or accusations. I'm leaving you the chance to remember who you were before ambition and fear drove you apart, the chance to be the men I knew you could be. Friedrich will need you, Andreas, not as a partner or a rival, but as the friend who once helped him believe in himself. And you'll need him, the brother who saw past your common birth to recognize your uncommon brilliance. Don't let pride destroy what time and trust built. Don't let the past poison the future. Remember the 3 young dreamers in that first tiny office, when anything seemed possible if you just believed in each other. It's never too late to build new bridges. With love and hope. Clara. The letter fell from Andreas's trembling hands. Friedrich reached across the table and gripped his old friend's shoulder, his own tears falling freely. "I forgot," Andreas whispered. "I forgot who we were." "We both did," Friedrich replied, "but Clara didn't, and neither did Sophie." Sophie watched as years of hurt and misunderstanding began to melt away. She pulled out her notebook and opened to a fresh page, beginning to write in the margins. The day bridges became stronger than walls. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle, on casting a warm glow through the cafe windows. 3 people sat together, surrounded by letters and photographs, memories and possibilities, as they began the careful work of rebuilding what had been broken. And somewhere, Sophie knew, her mother was smiling. The transformation of Lichtenberg and Associates continued through the autumn months, but it wasn't just the physical changes to the building that caught people's attention. It was the shift in the company's very soul, led by an unlikely trio, a reformed CEO, his teenage daughter, and his former rival turned friend again. The marble lobby had been reimagined into a welcoming space that Clara would have loved. Local. Artists' works hung on walls once dominated by corporate awards. Comfortable seating areas replaced rigid rows of chairs, and the sound of conversation and coffee machines created a warm atmosphere that drew people in rather than intimidating them. But the most remarkable change was happening on the middle floor, where Friedrich's new office had become the heart of a revolution in corporate culture. The door was always open, and it wasn't unusual to find him, Sophie, and Andreas huddled over old photographs and documents, planning the company's future while remembering its past. "Remember when we used to interview candidates in that tiny coffee shop because our office was too small?" Andreas laughed one afternoon, pointing to an old photo. "And Clara would insist on buying coffee for everyone, even though we could barely afford it," Friedrich added, his voice warm with memory. Sophie sat cross-legged in her father's guest chair, her ever-present notebook open as she documented these stories. She had begun compiling what she called the Heart of Business, a collection of tales from the company's early days that revealed the human side of corporate success. Tell me about the cleaning staff accounting classes, she prompted Andreas, who looked surprised that she knew about that. Your mother told you about that? She wrote about everything, Sophie smiled. She believed that true success stories weren't just about profit margins. The mention of Clara still brought a touch of sadness to their eyes, but it was different now. A bittersweet acknowledgement of her continuing influence on their lives. Her vision for the company was finally being realized, though she wasn't there to see it. One morning, Friedrich called an all-staff meeting in the newly renovated lobby. Employees gathered, curious about the announcement. Many were still adjusting to their CEO's transformation from a distant figure to an engaged leader who knew their names and asked about their families. When I started this company with Andreas, Friedrich began, his voice carrying clearly through the space. We had nothing but dreams and determination. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that it's not just numbers that make a company successful, it's people. Today, we're returning to those roots. He unveiled the company's new initiative, the Clara Lichtenberg Foundation for Business Education. The program would provide financial education and support to underprivileged students, with a special focus on languages and international business. My late wife believed that knowledge shouldn't be limited by circumstance, Friedrich continued, his voice thick with emotion. She proved that by teaching our daughter German through discarded books and determination. Now we're going to help others find their path to success, regardless of their background. Sophie watched from beside Andreas as her father announced the Foundation's first project, converting the old executive dining room into a learning center, where employees could both teach and study. The cleaning staff who had benefited from Andreas's lessons years ago would be among the first volunteer tutors. We're not just a financial institution, Friedrich declared. We're a community, and starting today, we're going to act like one. The announcement was met with applause, but it was the spontaneous conversations that broke out afterward that truly showed the impact. Employees began sharing their own skills they could teach, suggesting programs they could develop, offering to mentor others. Later that day, Sophie found her father standing by the window in his office, holding a framed photograph of Clara. She would have loved this, she said softly, joining him. Friedrich nodded, wiping away a tear. She always saw the potential in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves, even when I couldn't see it in myself. That's why she left the letters, Sophie said, opening her notebook to reveal another sealed envelope she had been saving, including this one. Friedrich looked at the envelope in surprise. On it, in Clara's handwriting, were the words, "For Friedrich, when you remember that success is measured in smiles, not just stocks." I think it's time, Sophie said gently, handling him the letter. As Friedrich read Clara's words, his face softened with each line. When he finished, he pulled Sophie into a tight hug, the letter pressed between them like a bridge connecting past and present. Your mother wrote that she knew this day would come, he said, his voice rough with emotion, that once I remembered who I was meant to be, I would need one last reminder of why it all matters. Outside the office, the sounds of the transformed company drifted up. Conversations, laughter, the hum of genuine human connection replacing the cold efficiency that had dominated for so long. In the lobby, a young artist was hanging a new painting, while a group of employees gathered around a senior accountant who was explaining investment basics to the maintenance staff. The sun streamed through the windows, catching the gold lettering of the newly installed plaque, Lichtenberg and Associates, building success through community. Below it, in smaller letters, was Clara's favorite quote, "The greatest investments we make are in the people we believe in." Sophie added another note in her notebook's margins. The day profit and purpose found their balance. She looked up to see Andreas in the doorway, carrying a stack of old photos and documents. "Ready to help me plan the next phase?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with the same enthusiasm that had marked their early days. Friedrich wiped his eyes and smiled, gesturing to his conference table. "Always, after all, we have a legacy to build." The three of them gathered around the table, spreading out pictures and plans, while outside, the company Clara had always envisioned continued to take shape, one human connection at a time. The financial world couldn't help but notice the changes at Lichtenberg and Associates. What started as whispered conversations in corporate corridors soon became the talk of the industry. A leading business magazine ran a cover story titled "The Human Side of High Finance: How a Teenage Girl Transformed a Corporate Giant." The article focused on the unusual sight of Sophie, still carrying her worn notebook, leading potential clients through the renovated lobby, explaining her father's vision for a different kind of financial institution. She had a way of making complex financial concepts accessible while weaving in the human stories behind the numbers. "You see," she told a group of visiting executives, "every transaction has two spreadsheets, the one with numbers and the one with human impact. We believe in balancing both." The visitors watched as she pointed out various elements of the transformed space: the local art gallery that had already launched 3 careers, the coffee shop staffed by business students earning practical experience, the learning center, where executives and maintenance staff sat side by side studying financial literacy. "But the real magic," Sophie continued, "happens upstairs." She led them to the middle floor, where Friedrich and Andreas were tag team teaching a class on international business negotiations to a mixed group of employees. The two men had developed a remarkable dynamic, playing off each other's strengths and sharing stories from their early days. "Remember to consider the human element in every deal," Friedrich was saying. "Numbers tell part of the story, but people tell the rest." Andreas nodded, adding, "Sometimes the best negotiation strategy is simply listening to understand, not to respond." The visiting executives exchanged glances, clearly surprised by this unusual approach. One of them raised his hand. "But what about shareholder value? Isn't this all rather inefficient?" Sophie smiled, pulling out a graph from her notebook. "Actually, our productivity has increased by 30% since implementing these changes. It turns out that happy, engaged employees who feel valued tend to create more value." Later that afternoon, Sophie found herself in the learning center, helping Mrs. Henderson, who had insisted on volunteering, teach basic German to a group of interested employees. The elderly woman had embraced her role with enthusiasm, bringing homemade cookies to every class and sharing stories about raising Sophie. "Sie sind eine ausgezeichnete Lehrerin," one of the maintenance staff said carefully, making Mrs. Henderson beam with pride. The sound of familiar laughter drew Sophie's attention to the door, where she saw Friedrich and Andreas showing a group of young interns their first office lease agreement, complete with coffee stains and hopeful signatures, "We." "Had no idea what we were doing," Andreas admitted, "but we believed in each other." "And Clara believed in us," Friedrich added softly, his hand resting on a framed photo of the 3 of them that now hung prominently in the learning center. Sophie excused herself from the German class and joined them, pulling out her notebook. "Tell them about the time Mom convinced you both to sponsor that local youth orchestra," she prompted, ready to add another story to her growing collection. As Friedrich and Andreas shared the tale, Sophie noticed a young intern watching her intently. During a break, the girl approached, her own notebook clutched nervously in her hands. "How did you do it?" she asked Sophie. "How did you know you could change things?" Sophie thought for a moment, then opened her notebook to Clara's last letter to Friedrich. "My mother taught me that change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments, in tiny choices to see people as people, not just resources or obstacles." She showed the intern her collection of stories, the margins filled with observations and insights. Every business has 2 stories running, parallel, the official one in the annual reports and the human one in the daily interactions. The trick is making them work together. The intern nodded thoughtfully, then asked, would you teach me about both sides?" Sophie smiled, remembering her own journey. That's exactly what this place is for now. As the day wound down, Friedrich found Sophie in her office, surrounded by notebooks filled with company stories and employee interviews. She was working on a new project, a comprehensive history of Lichtenberg and Associates that focused on the human moments that had shaped its success. You know, Friedrich said, sitting beside her, your mother would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished here. Sophie looked up, her eyes bright. She already was proud. She knew this would happen, all of it. That's why she prepared so carefully, why she left all those letters. She believed in the power of human connection to transform everything it touches. Friedrich picked up one of Sophie's notebooks, reading the quote she had written that morning. Success isn't a destination we reach alone, but a journey we share with others. Clara's words? He asked. Sophie shook her head, smiling. No, those are yours. From one of your old poetry-filled financial reports. Mom kept them all. Outside the office, the sounds of the evening German class mixed with discussions from the learning center and conversations from the lobby below. The company was alive with the kind of energy that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports, but could be felt in every interaction. Friedrich wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders, both of them watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of promise. So, he said, what's next on your agenda for transforming the financial world? Sophie opened her notebook to a fresh page, her pen poised to write. Well, she smiled. Mom left quite a few more ideas in those letters. 6 months after Sophie's arrival, the lobby of Lichtenberg & Associates was buzzing with excitement. The company was hosting its first Community Impact Showcase, an event that would have been unthinkable in the old days of strict corporate hierarchy and closed-door policies. The marble floors that had once echoed with hurried footsteps now hosted displays highlighting various initiatives born from the company's transformation. Local artists whose works adorned the walls mingled with executives and maintenance staff. Students from the financial literacy programs proudly demonstrated their newfound knowledge to potential investors. Sophie stood at the center of it all, her trusted notebook in hand, watching her mother's vision come to life. She had traded her simple cotton dress for a professional outfit that somehow managed to bridge the gap between corporate polish and approachable warmth, much like the company itself had done. Excuse me, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Are you Sophie? Lichtenberg? She turned to find a young woman in her early 20s clutching a newspaper article. I read about what you've done here, the woman continued. I was hoping, well, I have a similar situation with my father's company. Before Sophie could respond, Friedrich appeared at her side, followed closely by Andreas. Both men had developed an almost sixth sense for when she might need support, though they were learning to let her handle things her own way. Perhaps we should all talk, Sophie suggested, leading the group to one of the comfortable seating, areas that had replaced the rigid waiting room chairs. Tell us about your company. As the young woman shared her story of a family business losing its way, Sophie opened her notebook to a fresh page. But this time, instead of taking notes, she started sharing some of the stories she had collected. Tales of how small changes had created ripple effects throughout Lichtenberg & Associates. You see, she explained, transformation doesn't always start with grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with simply remembering why the company began in the first place. Friedrich nodded, adding, we had to learn that success isn't just measured in profit margins. It's measured in the lives we touch, the communities we build. Andreas, who had been quietly listening, pulled out his phone and showed them his company's new website. Kerber International had undergone its own transformation, inspired by the changes at Lichtenberg & Associates. The fierce rivalry between the companies had been replaced by a collaborative approach that was revolutionizing the financial industry. Your mother, Andreas told Sophie, his voice soft with memory, once told me that competition doesn't have to mean combat. She said we could compete to see who could do the most good, create the most positive impact. The young woman listened intently, hope beginning to replace the worry in her eyes. As they talked, more people gathered around, drawn by the conversation. Soon, what had started as a private discussion became an impromptu seminar on humanitarian business practices. Sophie found herself sharing more stories from her notebook, not just about Lichtenberg & Associates, but about all the other companies that had begun following their example. The ripple effect had spread far beyond their own walls. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Sophie found herself in her father's office with Friedrich and Andreas, looking out over the city lights. The three of them had developed a comfortable routine of ending each day together, sharing stories and planning for the future. "I found something interesting today," Friedrich said, pulling out an old document. It was a business plan, written in 3 different handwritings, his, Andreas's, and Clara's. The margins were filled with notes and dreams that went far beyond profit projections. "Our original vision," Andreas said softly, touching the faded paper, "before we got lost in the numbers." Sophie studied the document, recognizing her mother's elegant handwriting. "A company is not just a business entity, it's a force for positive change in the world." "She never gave up on that vision," Friedrich said, putting an arm around Sophie. "She just found a different way to make it happen." Sophie opened her notebook, comparing the old business plan to her current projects. The parallels were striking. The same emphasis on human connection, the same belief in the power of education and opportunity, the same understanding that true success went beyond financial metrics. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a section of the original plan. "You wanted to create a learning center back then too. You wanted the company to be a place where people could grow, not just work." Friedrich and Andreas exchanged glances, remembering their younger selves and the dreams they had temporarily forgotten. The company they had built now was actually closer to their original vision than the corporate giant it had become in between. "Your mother would love what we've created here," Andreas said, gesturing to the transformed office space around them, "though I suspect she knew this would happen eventually." Sophie smiled, pulling out another sealed letter from her notebook, one she had been saving for exactly this moment. The envelope read, "For all 3 of you when the circle is complete." Friedrich and Andreas moved closer as she broke the seal, their eyes misty with anticipation. Clara's words, written years ago, seemed to bridge past and present, weaving together all the threads of their shared story. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows as they read together, their quiet laughter and occasional tears marking the final piece of Clara's carefully orchestrated transformation falling into place. Outside, the last few guests from the showcase were leaving, carrying with them stories of what business could be when humanity was put first. In the margins of her notebook, Sophie made one final note for the day. The moment when a dream became a legacy. The company had indeed come full circle, but this ending was really just another beginning. The contents of Clara's final letter had set in motion yet another wave of changes at Lichtenberg and Associates. Her last message hadn't just been about celebrating their transformation, it had been a blueprint for the future, complete with ideas and suggestions that showed just how far ahead she had been thinking. "My dearest family," she had written, "for that is what you all are now. Friedrich, my love, Andreas, my friend, and Sophie, my heart. If you're reading this, then the walls have come down, the bridges have been built, and you've remembered who you were meant to be all along. But remember, this is not the end of the story. It's simply the beginning of a new chapter." The sixth letter had included detailed plans for expanding their educational initiatives, suggestions for community outreach programs, and ideas for reshaping the financial industry itself. Clara had envisioned a network of companies, working together to prove that profit and purpose could coexist. One morning, a week after reading the letter, Sophie arrived at the office to find her father and Andreas already deep in discussion, surrounded by papers and coffee cups. They were working on implementing Clara's latest suggestion, a mentorship program that would pair experienced executives with promising students from underprivileged backgrounds. "The applications are already pouring in," Andreas reported, waving a stack of papers, "both from students and from executives wanting to mentor them." Friedrich nodded, making notes in what Sophie recognized as his own version of her notebook habit, something he had started doing recently. "Clara was right," he said. "People want to be part of something meaningful. They just need to be given the chance." Sophie settled into her usual spot, pulling out her notebook. The margins were filling up with new stories every day. Tales of lives changed, bridges built, dreams realized. She had started digitizing them all, creating an archive that would preserve not just the company's history, but its heart. "By the way," Andrea said, turning to Sophie, "that young woman from the showcase, she called this morning. Her father agreed to meet with us about transforming their company culture." Sophie smiled, adding another note to her collection. What had started as one company's transformation was spreading, creating a movement within the financial industry. Other firms were beginning to follow their lead, realizing that success and humanity weren't mutually exclusive. The Learning Center had become a model for corporate education programs, with other companies sending representatives to study their approach. Mrs. Henderson's German classes had evolved into a full-fledged language exchange program, with employees teaching each other everything from Mandarin to Arabic. Even the art gallery in the lobby had grown, now hosting regular exhibitions that brought together the corporate and creative worlds. The latest show featured photographs documenting the company's transformation, including several candid shots of Sophie, Friedrich, and Andreas working together. "Look at this," Friedrich said, pulling out an email. "The business school wants us to develop a case study about our transformation. They want to teach future business leaders about the importance of human connection in corporate success." Sophie looked up from her notebook. "Mom would love that. She always said that education was the key to lasting change." "Speaking of education," Andreas added, "the first class of Clara Lichtenberg Foundation scholars will be starting their internships next month. 20 students who otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to enter the financial world." Friedrich stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Sophie hadn't walked into our lobby that day," he mused, "if Clara hadn't planned so carefully for our awakening." "She knew we'd need a push," Andreas said, joining him at the window. "She knew we'd need Sophie to remind us of who we used to be." Sophie watched them from her seat, these two men who had moved from friends to rivals and back to family again. In her notebook, she had documented their journey, but more importantly, she had witnessed their hearts opening up again. "The story isn't over yet," she reminded them, thinking of her mother's final letter. "We're just getting started." Outside. The office, the sounds of the transformed company drifted up. Conversations in multiple languages, laughter from the learning center, the buzz of ideas being shared and dreams being built. The marble lobby that had once intimidated visitors now welcomed them into a space where business and humanity danced together in perfect balance. Friedrich turned from the window and picked up Clara's letter again, reading aloud the final lines. "Remember that every day is a chance to choose who we want to be, what legacy we want to leave. Make those choices count, my loves. Make them matter." Sophie added one more note to her margin. "The day we realize that endings are just beginnings in disguise." The sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the office floor, but the future ahead was bright with possibility. Clara's vision had not just been preserved, it had been amplified, transformed, and set loose into the world. And in the heart of it all, a father, his daughter, and their restored friend continued to write new chapters in a story that was far from over. 1 year to the day after Sophie first walked barefoot into the marble lobby, Lichtenberg and Associates was hosting its most ambitious event yet, the inaugural Human-Centered Business Summit. The transformed lobby was filled with representatives from companies around the world, all eager to learn about the revolutionary approach that had begun with one teenage girl and her mother's letters. Sophie stood at the podium, her trusted notebook beside her, looking out at the gathered crowd. She had grown in the past year, not just in height, but in presence. The simple dress and bare feet had been replaced by elegant professional attire, but she still carried herself with that same quiet determination that had caught everyone's attention that first day. "A year ago," she began, her voice clear and confident, "I walked into this building with nothing but a notebook and a dream my mother had carefully planted. Today, I want to share with you not just what we've accomplished, but what we've learned about the true meaning of success." The audience listened intently as Sophie shared stories from her collection, tales of transformation that went far beyond business metrics. She told them about Mrs. Henderson's German classes that had evolved into a full language and cultural exchange program, about maintenance staff who had become financial literacy teachers, about executives who had rediscovered their passion for mentoring. Friedrich and Andreas sat in the front row, both men looking proudly at the young woman who had helped them remember who they were meant to be. Behind them sat the first graduating class of the Clara Lichtenberg Foundation scholars, 20 young people who were already changing the face of the financial industry. But perhaps the most powerful lesson we've learned, Sophie continued, is that business is not just about transactions, it's about transformations. Every decision we make has the potential to change someone's life, to build a bridge, to open a door. She gestured to the art gallery walls, where a special exhibition had been mounted for the summit. These photographs tell our story, but they also tell a universal story about the power of human connection in the corporate world. The exhibited photos captured moments from throughout the year, Friedrich teaching a group of young interns about ethical decision-making, Andreas leading a workshop on community engagement, Sophie and Mrs. Henderson conducting a German class for a mixed group of executives and staff members. My mother understood something fundamental about business, Sophie said, her voice softening with emotion. She knew that true success isn't measured quarterly. It's measured in generations. The changes we make today create ripples that affect not just our employees and clients, but their families, their communities, and ultimately, their futures. She opened her notebook, now accompanied by several volumes of collected stories and observations. Over the past year, we've documented hundreds of stories of transformation. But today, I want to share one final letter from my mother, one she wrote specifically for this moment. Friedrich and Andreas straightened in their seats. They hadn't known about this letter. Sophie pulled out an envelope that looked different from the others, newer, as if Clara had written it closer to her final days. "Dear friends and future changemakers," Sophie read, her voice clear despite the emotion. "If you're hearing these words, then something remarkable has happened. A dream of humanizing the corporate world has taken root and begun to grow. You're here because you believe, as I always did, that business can be both profitable and purposeful. To my dear Friedrich and Andreas, thank you for remembering who you were meant to be. Your journey back to your true selves has inspired others to examine their own paths. To my beloved Sophie, you have carried these dreams further than I could have imagined. Your strength lies not just in your intelligence or determination, but in your ability to see the best in people and help them see it in themselves. And to all of you gathered here today, remember that every business decision is also a human decision. Every policy affects a person. Every change ripples through communities. Choose wisely, lead with heart, and never forget that the greatest asset any company can have is its humanity. The future of business lies not in higher walls, but in stronger bridges. Build them well. With eternal hope and love, Clara. The room was silent for a moment after Sophie finished reading, the words settling into hearts and minds. Then slowly people began to stand, applauding not just the letter or the speech, but the vision it represented. Friedrich made his way to the podium and embraced his daughter, while Andreas joined them, completing the circle that Clara had envisioned so long ago. The three of them stood together, watching as business leaders from around the world began sharing their own stories of transformation, their own dreams of change. Sophie opened her notebook one more time, adding a new note in the margins, the day a personal journey became a global movement. She looked out at the crowd, seeing not just business leaders and executives, but potential changemakers, bridge builders, dream weavers. The transformation that had begun with her barefoot walk into the lobby had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. But somehow Sophie knew her mother had seen it all along. Clara had understood that sometimes the greatest changes start with the smallest steps, and that love, for family, for purpose, for possibility, could transform even the coldest corporate giant into a force for good in the world. As the summit drew to a close, Sophie found herself back in her father's office, sitting in what had become her favorite spot by the window. The city lights were coming on, creating a tapestry of warmth against the darkening sky. Friedrich and Andreas joined her, carrying cups of coffee, a habit they had maintained from their early days together. "Your mother would be so proud," Friedrich said softly, watching his daughter add final notes to her ever-present notebook. "Though somehow I think she knew exactly how this would all turn out." Sophie smiled, touching the worn cover of her original notebook, now retired to a special place on her desk, replaced by newer volumes but never forgotten. "She believed in the power of stories to change hearts," she said. "That's why she left us so many letters, so many breadcrumbs to follow back to our best selves." Andreas picked up one of the photographs from the summit, a shot of all three of them laughing together during a presentation. "Look how far we've come," he mused, "from rivals to family, from profit-focused to purpose-driven." The transformation of Lichtenberg and Associates had indeed been remarkable. The company had not only maintained its financial success, but had actually grown stronger, proving that humanity and profitability could coexist beautifully. Other companies were following their lead, creating a ripple effect throughout the industry. "I found something interesting yesterday," Sophie said, pulling out an old document from her notebook. It was the original article about her first day at the company, the one Andreas had planted to try to create scandal. "Remember this?" Both men laughed, the memory now more amusing than painful. "I was so sure I had the perfect plan to force Friedrich out," Andreas admitted. "Instead, you forced us both to grow up." "Clara forced us," Friedrich corrected gently. "She just used Sophie as her perfectly chosen instrument of change." Sophie stood and walked to the art wall they had installed in the office. Among the photographs and artwork hung a special frame containing her mother's final letter, displayed alongside the first notebook she had carried into the building. Below it sat a growing collection of books, compilations of the stories they had gathered over the past year, now used as teaching tools in business schools around the world. "You know what's amazing?" she said, turning back to her father. "And Andreas. Every day someone new walks into our lobby with their own story, their own dream of transformation. It's like Mom created a perpetual motion machine of positive change." Friedrich joined her at the wall, touching the frame that held Clara's letter. "She always said that business should be about more than money. It should be about creating value, not just for shareholders, but for everyone it touches." "Speaking of touching lives," Andreas added, "did you see the applications for next year's Foundation Scholars? Over 1,000 candidates, and each one with the potential to change the world in their own way." Sophie nodded, returning to her notebook. "I've been thinking about that. What if we expanded the program? Not just financial education, but a whole network of companies committed to human-centered business practices. We could create a movement that—" She stopped, noticing both men smiling at her. "What?" "You sound just like your mother," Friedrich said softly, always seeing the next possibility, the next bridge to build. Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they were happy tears. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "The day we realized that endings are really just new beginnings." Outside the office, the sounds of the transformed company continued, languages mixing together, laughter floating up from the learning center, the quiet buzz of human connection replacing the cold efficiency of the past. The marble lobby, that had once intimidated visitors, now welcomed dreamers from around the world, each one carrying their own hopes for transformation. Friedrich wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders, while Andreas poured them all fresh coffee. The three of them stood together, watching the city lights twinkle like stars, each one representing a story waiting to be transformed. "So," Friedrich asked, "what's next in that notebook of yours?" Sophie smiled, thinking of all the possibilities ahead. "Mom always said that the best stories never really end. They just keep growing, changing, touching new lives." She opened her notebook to a fresh page. "I think it's time to start our next chapter." And so, in an office high above the city, three people who had been brought together by one woman's vision continued planning their next transformation. The notebook that had started it all sat nearby, its pages filled with the past year's journey, but more importantly, with the promise of journeys yet to come. Because Clara had been right all along.